This video presents a motivic analysis of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the introduction and the first phrase. On open music theory, we've defined the motive as a short and regularly recurring unit of music. And Beethoven opens his Fifth Symphony with what is maybe the most recognizable motive in all of classical music, that descending minor third. So I'm going to start by circling and labeling that as motive X. Right away, Beethoven gives us a transposed version of that motive. So I'm going to circle that version and label it XT for transposed. Some people, instead of labeling this XT, would label it X prime to indicate that it's just a varied statement of motive X. And you can use whatever system your teacher prefers. The system that I'm using, the XT, isn't a formalized system. I'm just using letters to indicate what alteration has been applied to motive X. So the T here stands for transposition, but there's no like formal letters to learn there as far as what alterations can occur. Okay, so already in this introduction, we have something happening here. We have a statement of motive X, and then a transposed version. Now in the past, when I've asked students to do a motivic analysis of the opening here, some of them have circled the entire opening like this and labeled it a motive. And I think that breaking it up into smaller units is a little bit better because it shows already that something is happening in the opening. It shows that we have this motive that's stated and already it's transposed. Whereas if you circle the whole thing, then you aren't showing that motion that already occurs in the introduction. And it's going to turn out that these two statements of the motive, X and X transposed, are important for our analysis later in the work. Okay, after this introduction, Beethoven starts layering statements of the motive, and he does this with 3 statements at a time. The first one occurs in violin 2, then the second one in the viola, and then the third one in violin 1. Right, so that sounds like this. Okay, so there's our first grouping of 3 motives that have been layered. This first one that occurs in violin 2 is a statement of motive X. And then this second one that occurs in the viola is an altered statement of motive X. Instead of a descending minor third, we have a descending minor second. So I'm going to label that one XA for altered. And then this third one is once again a descending minor third, and now it's transposed to begin on E flat as opposed to G. After that initial layering of the 3 motives, we get a second layering of 3 versions of the motive, and this time they're slightly different. So here's our first one again in violin 2, then we move down to the viola, and then violin 1. So there's our second grouping of 3 motives. Okay, and that one sounds like this. Right. So this first one in violin 2 has been altered so that instead of beginning with a descending minor third, it now has a descending perfect fourth. Then in the viola, we get another altered statement. So that's that same descending minor second that the viola stated earlier. And then in violin 1, we're back to a transposed statement. There we go. So what's interesting about this this first half of the phrase is that it begins with the statement of motive X from the introduction, and it ends with the same transposed statement of motive X from the introduction. So the introduction gives us G down to E flat and F down to D, and then in the first half of the phrase we begin with that G down to E flat, and then violin 1 ends it with the F down to D version of motive X. So that's why it's important to recognize those 2 statements in the introduction, because they sort of foreshadow what's going to happen here in the first half of the phrase. In the second half of the phrase, Beethoven continues this layering effect of motives, but now we get fewer statements of the motive. So we get 1 statement in violin 1, and we get a second statement in violin 2 and in the viola as well. They're playing the same thing. instead of the 3 statements that we had in the first half of the phrase. So that first statement sounds like this, and the second statement sounds like this. Right, so there's our first set of overlaps, and then Beethoven's going to do that again. 1 and 2. This first statement is actually related to motive X, right? Motive X is G down to E flat, and here we have this F that fills in the space between G and E flat. So I'm going to call this one XF for X filled in. And then the second statement right here just reverses the direction of XF. So we would call that inversion. So whereas XF goes down, XF inverted goes up. Right? So that's all we mean by inversion, is that the direction has been changed. So Beethoven's going to do that same thing again. Right? So we get XF again, and we get XF inverted again. Oops. Try writing that a little better. And then after that, to get us to the cadence, Beethoven has 2 overlapping statements of the motive, but now they're in one voice, whereas before we had them spread out among the instruments. Now violin 1 is going to state two overlapping versions of the motive. We get XF, and then we get X transposed. Right, so XF is, and X transposed is, right? And then the rhythm also has been varied of X transposed. Instead of getting the, right, we just get, and then we arrive at our cadence. So there's a motivic analysis of the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.